did at that point in time. So the Iranian Revolution was something that kind of motivated me to study protest and so on. From an academic side of protest, why do people protest in general? Why do they engage in it? Well, there's a really simple answer. It's that they can accomplish or achieve something with those, with the tactic of protest. I believe that individuals are essentially rational. They do things to get something out of it. It may not necessarily be material, but typically people turn to protest when other forms of changing their society are not effective. Things like the ballot box is not being responsive to individuals. And you see when we have societies, we've seen kind of two parties that have controlled Congress over the last 10 to 12 years. And depending on which one of those parties that were in power, there was a number of pieces of legislation that were not addressed, especially in the US Senate. This has become sort of commonplace in our system of government. And when these are issues that are supported by 60, 70, 80% of the American public, it starts to lead to Americans being frustrated and turning to other methods to accomplish those changes in their society. As far as what the Constitution says about protest, there's not a whole lot in the very specific aspect of the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights guarantee us the right of freedom of speech and assembly, organization, things along those lines. And so that's where the protection on our ability to protest is located. But in a greater sense, the foundation of our government, what we find in the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, and specifically the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, that protest is a natural and an important part of having an engaged citizenry. And the idea is we as individuals form a social contract with our government. We give up certain rights in exchange for social order. A government that can maintain law and order and solve the major social problems or larger logistical problems that we need to accomplish in society. And one of those key elements or key rights that we give up is that right to self-government or self-governance. And as Thomas Jefferson viewed it, for a government to be working, people have to be engaged. And if the government stops living up to its bargain, where it's no longer protecting the natural rights, it's not only our duty as citizens, but it's not only our right, but it's also our duty as a citizen to do something to re-alter, reform, rechange that form of government. I just want to read a short little quote from Thomas Jefferson. What country can preserve its liberties if its rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is the natural manure. Now, obviously, that can sound a little radical, a little crazy if you want to, but the idea is if people are actively engaged in government, they're a check on that government from ignoring their concerns, issues, and calls for change. And so I worry a little bit about what we're seeing today, because I feel on one level we sort of have a government that's not living up to its side of the social contract, and this is what's motivating people to protest. They feel like their democratic channels are no longer working the way that they used to. As far as which protest methods are most effective, it really depends on the context. In modern democracies, typically peaceful marches and demonstrations and boycotts oftentimes are the thing that leads or initiates those changes. But now think about an authoritarian regime, an event like Tiananmen Square, when people protest, if you're shot and killed and arrested and tortured, it tends to deter people from doing that again, because ultimately they don't want to risk their lives. I talked about it, individuals being a rational idea of wanting to rational thought and want to accomplish something. Well, if you do that, if you believe that idea, you're not going to engage in suicide. You're not going to stand up to a tank and get run over, because there's no benefit to that in the long run. As far as things like letter writing and social media, I think today, with all of the ease, everybody has that ability to text and so on. I'm not sure that's very effective. It may call some attention to it, but I don't know that it makes any difference to government. I kind of feel that politicians don't really pay much attention to emails anymore and so on. I think to a little extent, the calling and visiting their offices probably has has a bigger impact. And it should make sense if we're talking about something like apartheid or Tiananmen Square, that ultimately people are going to resort to violence. It may be terrorism is the only one that they can escape repression. But if you're being attacked violently, oftentimes it's your only recourse is to use violence yourself. And it's a really scary situation because that's what ultimately produces civil wars, when those democratic, peaceful channels break down and you really only have that other opportunity. Essentially, protest has become a little bit more prominent in modern times, simply by the idea that we live in urban areas, we live in cities. Because of that, people are more closely packed in. There's more likelihood of a protest, right? When people live in very rural areas and live far, large miles away from each other, it's a little bit more of a difficult thing to have protests. We interact with each other, all of those types of things. One area that social media plays a major role is organizing and mobilizing people to hold protests at a given point in time, disseminating information. And that's always been fairly important. If we go back to the American or the French Revolution, the printing presses were key elements of mobilization and disseminating information. In modern times, the Philippine Revolution in 1986, what we call people power, utilized an older radio station, a Catholic radio station, that was turned into sort of the voice of the revolution and used to mobilize people. We've seen things in the Arab Spring where YouTube and Google and Twitter were used to organize protests, and that's kind of ushered in a new trend. But it's one thing to use it to organize and mobilize people. It's a very different thing to just say, oh, I'm mad about this, blah, 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 on Twitter. I'm not sure that that's really all that effective, other than fighting with whoever else it is on Twitter that reads such things. The other thing, lastly, I think it's critically important that you are civically engaged because of this aspects of protest and things along those lines. What I'm talking about, if government's not paying attention to you, you don't do anything, they're just going to keep doing it. Protest is the one where you can voice your opinion, and it's one of the great things about our country. We have that ability to speak our mind. So young students of today, make sure that you stand up for whatever it is that you think is important in your life, whatever wrong you think that's occurred to you. It's the only thing that keeps the governments and the politicians to paying attention to their side of that social contract. Thank you. It's nice talking to you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining. We just saw a video for Dr. Steve Garrison, and if you missed it, it is okay. It will be on our team site that you are on now to be able to access it later. We'll also post the links on the chat. So now for just some housekeeping rules, so that we can hear the panelists talk, just please mute your mics to avoid any background noise that may happen. You can use the chat box. Obviously, I see some students have already been posting on there for any questions or interactions that you may have. There is a hand symbol that you are able to use to be able to ask a question. You are able to use that. If you have any tech support issues, we do have people on the line that can help you with that. So that would be myself, Angie Rivera, or Jade Carew, also known as JC, Jessica Sierra, and Cindy Favela. And then just to kind of go over our agenda today, we just saw a video of Dr. Steve Garrison. And then we're going to have panelist introductions with Tiffany being our Professor Tiffany Nakost being our moderator. If you have any questions to the panelists, you are able to use the chat and or use a hand symbol so that we know that you have a question. At the end, if you want to share any student experiences that you may have already had in regards to protest, or you have any feedback questions, you are able to do so towards the end. At the end, we also have another video from Summer Wesley, which is an activist for the Choctaw Nation. And then after that, that will conclude our program. I do want to say again and reiterate that This PowerPoint and the resources that will be available to you will stay on the team site. So if you have any questions, comments or concerns, or you want to see the material again, it will always be on here. So now I would like to introduce our professor, our government professor, Tiffany Nakas, who is our lead moderator, and she works at Eastfield Dallas College.
Thank you, Ms. Rivera. As I said, my name is Tiffany Nakas, and I teach government here at the Eastfield campus. And I want to say welcome to Constitution Day. So today, over 200 years ago, September 17th, 1787, the Constitution was written. And today we are going to focus on the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And so just to give you a little, to put all this in perspective, the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to peacefully and assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. So today our conversation is going to focus on the First Amendment, most specifically the right to protest. And so let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is going to be Professor Kat Ruggiero Van de Venter, and she teaches U.S. history here at Eastfield campus of Dallas College. She has an expertise in Mexican American history and civil rights. She is a member of the League of United Latin American Citizens, also known as LULAC. She is a former faculty advisor of the Eastfield Student LULAC chapter as well. Our next panelist is going to be Myra Rocio Fiero, and she is a Dallas native. Her life experiences have led her to her work in the community and to help address the challenges faced by youth experiencing homelessness. Last year, she rallied against the reinstatement of the City of Dallas Juvenile Curfew Ordinance, advocating instead for the city to provide youth with overnight safe spaces. She currently serves as co-chair as the Metro Dallas Youth Committee and liaison to the DAYBT, or Dallas Area Youth for Brighter Tomorrows. The DAYBT is a youth advisory action board that informs the services of the youth committee membership. She's also the founder and host of Serial and Civil Rights, a casual public forum for discussing local issues in Dallas, and a member of Our City, Our Future, a collective currently engaged in civic education as it relates to upcoming Dallas budget votes. Our next panelist is going to be Nathan Hunsinger. And so Nathan Hunsinger is a former photographer for the Dallas Morning News, current freelancer for the Dallas Observer, and graduate student at University of North Texas. The next panelist is Lena Bassuni. I'm sorry, I would say these are some of the amazing pictures from that Mr. Hunsinger has provided us with from the various protests that he's covered in the past 20 years. And then our next panelist is Lena Bassuni, a former manager and investigator at Berkeley Law's Human Rights Center. Lena is an open source investigator and co-founder of the Open Source Researchers of Color, or OSROC. She graduated from UC Berkeley in 2019 with a degree in Peace and Conflict Studies, where she is also a former manager at the Human Rights Investigation Lab. She's currently finishing her Master's of Human Rights Law from SOAS in London. Lena is Libyan, born in Houston, raised in Germany, Scotland, and California. In her free time, she founded and edits two zines called Diaspora Diaries. And then for our final panelist is Shakiba Mashiyavsky. She is a recent graduate from UC Berkeley, majoring in global studies and philosophy, a former manager at Berkeley Law's Human Rights Investigation Lab, co-founder of the Open Source Resources of Color, the OSROC Collective, legal research coordinator at Berkeley Law's Human Rights Center. And she is also a former community college transfer student, was born and raised in Iran and immigrated to San Diego at the age of 9. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. So now I have a few questions for the panelists, and so we'll go in the order in which I introduced you. So, Professor Ruggiero Vandervenner, can you tell us what is your particular involvement in protest, activism, or social justice, and what exactly made you get started?
Absolutely, but you know I don't go by Professor Ruggiero Vanderventer. Hi, I'm Professor Kat. A lot of my students are in here. So protesting is, I hate to say second nature to me, but it is. I thought about how to talk about this. So in my in-person classes, I always talk to my students about protesting, the correct ways to do it and the wrong ways to do it. And I am an example of both. So I will explain that really quickly. I actually went to UC Berkeley as well. I graduated much earlier than 2019, but we're not going to talk about the year. But so I went to Cal, and what ended up happening is I found a group called Mecha, which just is Mexicanos Estudiantes, sorry, I can't speak right now. Chicanos Hecha a Aztlán. Okay, so what that basically means is Mexican American students at Berkeley. We were incredibly political. I found my identity there. I found out I was a Chicana. I wasn't a Hispanic. I wasn't anything else. I was a Chicana, and I was very proud of that. But it is Hispanic Heritage Month right now, as you know, which we're trying to change to Latinx, actually. But anyway, I diverge. So what we found out was that the chancellor was trying to eliminate affirmative action, which at the time was essential to make sure that people, that minorities were given a fair chance to attend Cal and receive a degree, right? So we ended up taking over the chancellor's office, and I'm not going to go into all of this. I do in my classes, but I don't have that kind of time right now. So basically we took over the chancellor's office. The police came in, the riot police, they threw their tear gas, they beat me up. I went to jail. Along with 102 other students. We went to court the next morning, and the judge asked our defender who we were, and he said, and we said that our defender said that we're Cal students, and he said to get out of his courtroom, that learn how to protest correctly, and that was it. Learn your lesson. So I left that kind of situation more fired up than ever, and I was like, okay, well then I'm just going to be minoring and protesting at Cal, and I'm going to get arrested all the time. Okay, whatever. But what ended up happening the next day changed my life completely. The chancellor called me into his office. He showed me a video of me protesting and resisting police arrest, and it wasn't pretty. And he said, I have your name and I have your ID number. If I see it ever again on any of these kind of videos, I will expel you faster than you can blink. And I got all buffed up, and I said, well, I don't need you, and I just kind of got in his face or whatever. And instead of telling me to get the heck out of his office and to, shut up or whatever, he looked at me as a human being, and he said, look, I know that you are a strong Chicana, and you have a lot of desires, and you want to make change. I get that. Let me teach you how to do it the right way. He sat with me for 2 hours and taught me how to protest legally. He taught me how to write petitions. He taught me how to picket grocery stores when we had problems with farm workers being abused over grapes. I've had a lot of causes over the years. It caused me to change my major to civil rights, and I stayed with that, and I absolutely love it. My current protesting is mostly in the form of letter writing. I write a ton of letters to our senators. Please do that. They do make a difference. I call all the time. They're tired of hearing me. But I also go to events. I do marches. I was fortunate enough to meet a partner in life that took up my causes with me. So he would march with me. So we've been to several marches. Unfortunately, he did, as my students know, and Professor Nakas knows, I lost my husband on April 10th of this year to a massive heart attack. So I've been trying to keep up my activism without him, and it's been extremely hard, but I'm doing it. The George Floyd thing, of course, was the straw that broke the camel's back, basically. It's just the reason I protest, and I know this is a long story, I'm so sorry, but the reason I protest is because I'm completely passionate and I believe in change. And I'm so tired of people saying things are so much worse today than they ever have been and whatever. No, no. Read your history, study your history. It has been a lot worse. The only way it gets better is people like us that protest, that say that you're breaking the social contract, that you are no longer protecting every individual in the United States. You're protecting a certain group. So that's it. Sorry.
Thank you very much for sharing. I appreciate that. You sound very passionate. I like that. And so, same question for Myra. So, Myra, what is your particular involvement in protest and activism or social justice? And what made you get started? What's your story?
That's always a fun question. So my experience has me being kicked out of my family's home at 17 after coming out. And it wasn't until 2014 that I was actually able to marry my high school sweetheart. And we had to do it in California because in 2014, DOMA was still a thing and our marriage was not legal here in Texas. And shortly after we got married, actually, a year afterwards, I had the opportunity to be a volunteer at church, of all places, the local Cathedral of Hope here, which is the largest LGBTQ inclusive megachurch in the world. And I got to hear a sermon from the youth pastor who spoke to having young people show up at their Sunday school lesson because they didn't have any other place to be on Sunday morning. Their parents had already kicked them out. And everything else was closed on Sunday mornings. And at that point, I started to become a volunteer and become involved. Shortly after that, I participated in a teen pride event, which was the coolest thing I had ever seen. It was a pride event for folks under the age of 18 that included a drag show. It included a resource fair with folks like PFLAG, Rainbow LULAC was out there, HRC, the ACLU. We had a couple of people who were doing HIV testing, and it was a just really positive environment. But one of the things that really struck out to me was the fact that we had anti-protesters show up. The Bulldog Ministries out of Oklahoma actually drove out to Dallas to protest our Teen Pride event. And they ended up creating a wall across the street from our event where they had their protest rally. And I got to see the call to action be put out to the community, and the community here in Dallas respond by forming a wall of love around the youth and just blasting out the Pride playlists with music and dance and laughter, to the point where the young people who were inside our event never got to hear the hateful things that the protesters were shouting. And that for me was kind of just the start of things. At this point now, I'm the co-chair of the Metro Dallas Youth Committee. And I do that as a community volunteer, somebody who has lived experience. But the committee itself is made up of service providers and agencies that work with youth experiencing homelessness. And one of the things that I got to do last year was challenge the reinstatement of the lapsed juvenile curfew ordinance. And I know that for a lot of people, it's just something to blow off and scoff at. But the ordinance itself lapsed and expired. Like literally, the City Council of Dallas forgot to renew it. And only when it became apparent that they forgot to renew it and that Dallas didn't have a curfew ordinance was there a rush to reinstate it. Through all that, we were able to find out that 89% of the citations issued to young people were issued to youth of color. 70% of those citations were to Latinx youth, with 19% to Black youth. That makes no sense when you consider the racial makeup of the city, and also that the majority of the citations themselves were only issued out of one district. So in the end, we ended up losing our campaign. And that is to say that the curfew ordinance is still in effect. But one of the few things that we consider a victory would be the fact that we reduced the fine from $500 down to $50. And youth were then allowed 2 warnings prior to just getting the citation. I don't really consider those victories. What I still would like to see in the city of Dallas is spaces, an actual place where a young person can go to overnight, which we don't have. But the fight continues. I don't know if you guys are aware, but the city of Dallas has reenacted the curfew ordinance and waived the 2 warnings for this month in certain locations out of Deep Ellum. And incidentally, the curfew ordinance itself is considered unconstitutional because it is what they call a Terry stop. And it allows for the only probable cause for an officer to stop you to be that you look young. That is the only requirement to be stopped. So there's lots of work to do. Me personally, as far as protests, in the street, you're not likely to find me unless it's going to be a vigil or a memorial, which I am often out for. Black trans women are victimized way too often in our city, and that's the spaces that you'll find me. But I also do go out to protests because sometimes that's the only place where you can kind of vent your rage. But I have found it more effective to create change by actually engaging with folks and members of the community who are already engaged in the work to actually start doing better work.
Thank you for sharing your powerful story. Thank you. And so the next panelist is Nathan Hunsinger. And so same question to you. So what's your particular involvement in protests and activism and social justice, and what exactly got you started?
I've been covering protests for the last 20 years. Personally, I'm pretty political, but what's important as a journalist when I'm out there is I am not on your side. I'm not on anybody's side. I'm not on the police side. I'm not on the protester side. We really work on not being biased. And some of the times when I go to a protest and I actually believe in whatever they're saying, I say to myself, I can't get too much into this. I can't chant under my breath. I have to be a complete observer without getting into it. As journalists, we don't have bumper stickers on our cars that say who we vote for 20 years. Well, when I started, Facebook wasn't around, but I'd never had any political posts. Not that I don't have those beliefs, but it's very important that I don't show any bias coming into it. And in fact, when I'm at a protest, I hardly do any talking at all other than finding out where people are going and what's happening, because I can't be your friend at that point. If somebody is your friend at that point, they're not being a journalist. One of the things you should know is a press pass is not a secret weapon out there. As a member of the press, I don't have any special rights over anybody else. That just kind of identifies me that I'm press. Therefore, maybe I can step in the street to take a photo and they're not going to arrest me specifically for that. But I could be arrested for stepping in the street when the police officer says, do not step in the street. It's not a secret. There's nothing that makes me special other than I specifically cannot be arrested for being a member of the press. Hold on, I gotta get to my notes here. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Usually I stay on the sidewalk in between the police or whoever counter protesters and the protesters themselves, and to try to get an image that shows what's going on as far as if there's any kind of clash between them. But most of the time I'm looking directly at the protesters, and what I'm looking for, I love it when there's a lot of signs and a lot of people. Sometimes there's very few signs with very few people, and most of the time if there's more press than there are people, we'll look at each other and say, this isn't big enough. That's sorry the way that happens, but that happens. And I walk up, I'm looking for a lot of signs to say something. to try to get a point across, somebody looking passionate. I'm trying to look for somebody who, a lot of the times a protest will be an offshoot of a national protest, like the George Floyd thing. When a protest is going on there and we have the protests down here, I try to connect to that other protest at the same time as bringing a story that's coming from the people that I'm talking to, which does take some talking and some interviews and trying to figure out if there's somebody there that has a story that can like go along with the narrative of what's going on in the world. If it's a local protest, we usually have those people lined up to begin with. If you do carry signs and you're making your own signs, if you have a big curse word on it or whatever, we might take a picture of it, but it's not going to run in the paper, obviously. And unless it's just a really, really great photo, it's not even going to be on a website. And I'll tell you for sure that TV is not going to cover it. If there's somebody in the middle with a bunch of signs on the left and the right, you're not going to get a wide shot because that one sign ruins the entire thing. So be aware, be on the sides if you're going to have that on your sign, because it kind of ruins the whole photo for everybody. And what else do I have here? That's pretty much it. That's kind of how I see protests.
No, thank you. That was really interesting. I like those helpful tips that you provided. And to know about the press, like you can be arrested and thrown in jail. So I'm just curious, have you?
I have never been. The few people I do know who have been arrested, the charges got dropped, or they're continuing on a lawsuit. There is a kind of famous case of a photographer that I know named Avi Alderman, who he wasn't at a protest, but he was taking pictures at a dart stop, and they think the policemen there think you can't take their picture. Well, anyway, he kept taking their picture. He got arrested. I think he got abused in some way, and he sued the city. He made like $380,000 after about 5 years of lawsuit, because you can, every single one of you can legally take pictures and video of a police officer. You have to do what they tell you as far as getting out of the way, but you can have your camera there the whole time.
Thank you. Good to know. And like I said, your images are moving. They're very touching. And so for our next panelist, Lena Bassuni. So what is your particular involvement in protests and social justice? And what was your motivation? How did you get started?
Lena, make sure you're not muted.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me? Okay. I was just saying, thank you to Tiffany and Angie for welcoming us into this space. And thank you to Catherine and Myra and Nathan for sharing your stories and your backgrounds. It's really lovely just to hear everyone's, I think, really personal connections to the right to protest, and not only the right, but the necessity of, flooding the streets. My own kind of experience with protest, I think, was first about 10 years ago during the Libyan Revolution. And, as a Libyan that was displaced and, our family was in exile due to the dictatorship, when the revolution began, and, folks, I think the first protest in Libya was at the courthouse, primarily of mothers and sisters who were, whose siblings and fathers and husbands were imprisoned for political prisoners, I should say. And they flooded the streets in mourning and in sort of like a radical exhibition of hope to transform a dictatorship which had ravaged the country for 40 years. And so I remember in my home, we were living in California at the time. The TV was never off, and my dad would sit on his computer, and I don't think I ever saw the screen change from Facebook because he would be scrolling for images of his family, for images of his family fighting or in protests, to kind of find any evidence of what was happening when it seemed that we were so far away. And so that was kind of my first exposure to protests and to realizing the necessity, and not only the necessity, I think that the urge to, to unite, and the beauty and the pain of collective action and what that looked like, and having no other choice but to begin shouting, and how oftentimes that's the only thing that lets you breathe. So that was my first experience with protests, and it was also my first experience kind of witnessing open source material. And that's kind of what inspired me to become an open source researcher. And so when I say open source, it means basically anything that you can find online for free and publicly available. So that means everything that's posted on Facebook, everything on Instagram that's public, Twitter, documents that are published by governments. And I realized, seeing my dad, who's not an open source investigator, but knew that there was important information online about his family, about his country, about his potential liberty, about his potential return from exile, and realizing the potency and the potential of that material, when I got to college, was something that I really wanted to continue to explore. And I had that opportunity at the Human Rights Investigations Lab. And so I started researching in other countries that were not necessarily Libya, but close to home. So that was, I think my first my first confrontation, I should say. And then at Cal, there was also, as Catherine had described, protests were, I think, part of our education. And I think especially for folks like myself who are immigrants or children of immigrants, marginalized folks, minorities, people of color, what have you, protesting is often one of the only ways to engage in conversations with the powers that be, whether it's your institution, your school, your community, but also those conversations happen at home, right? It only takes changing your family's mind about something, and that's also protest, in my opinion. So that's my experience with it, and it led me about a year ago to co-found the Open Source Researchers of Color, or OSROC. And OSROC, as Shakiba, who's with us right now as well, will talk about, I was having a conversation with a friend, Michael, and he was also in the lab, and he's Egyptian and I'm Libyan. And I was saying, isn't it weird that there's all these kids who have no stake in the countries that they're researching, and they're getting all these opportunities to research places like my home, like a home I can't go back to. And there's no, how do I get to have some agency? How do my people get to have agency, and how they're researched, and doing our own researching of ourselves? And I was like, let's start a collective. Let's start a collective where we can be partners in liberation, where we can center the folks that are typically only studied, not included in the conversations, and more importantly, create educational resources to make open source research and open source information more accessible to the communities that need them. And I think Shakiba will speak a little bit more about the history of open source and whatnot, but I'll stop there, and maybe later on I can speak a little bit more about what OSROC has done and created. But thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for sharing your passionate story. And so for our last panelist, Shakiba Mashiyavsky.
Yeah. I just want to also begin by thanking all of the organizers for putting this event together, despite everything else that's going on around the world, and of course here in the United States. And just for every single person listening and taking the time out of an incredibly busy schedule to just listen to some of us talk, and hopefully we can engage in dialogue with one another in the remainder of this talk. I think to answer the question, I think my personal experience with protests is really twofold. In a lot of ways, I'm just beginning as a 22-year-old. And I think I've been very fortunate to be at a place like Berkeley, as Lena and Catherine have discussed a little bit, because Berkeley is a really active community, and that's really where I learned how to engage in collective dissent and have faith in this collective action. And I really carried that forward when I moved back to San Diego after I graduated from Berkeley, in trying to help friends and in collaboration begin to organize some of the protests in our own town of San Diego. On the other hand, as Lena was mentioning, my experience with protests has really been actually investigating the lethal force by government authorities in many countries around the world, from cities like Hong Kong to Iran to Haiti to Chile, and of course here in the United States, where we begin to analyze and examine hundreds of videos emerging from the people themselves, the very participants of the protest, who are uploading their videos and photos to YouTube, to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, etc. And the Human Rights Center really trained the students on how to investigate them, how to analyze them, and how to really verify. Like, how can you really understand that the protests that someone is saying took place in X country at this time really did happen at this time? And so through this experience, I think Lena and I both, along with the hundreds of other amazing people who come out of the Human Rights Center, is we learn how to learn the technical skills in order to be able to thoroughly investigate the protests that are happening and to verify them and to really report on them. In the same light, we really understood that there's a specific type of toll, and we call it vicarious trauma, that begins to take place when people are repeatedly seeing hundreds and hundreds of videos, whether you're an investigator or just someone sitting at home and you're scrolling through Instagram or Facebook, as Lena was describing, on the violence that's being portrayed by government authorities against the very protesters who are participating. And so when we decided to create OSROC, our collective, one of the pillars really has been, how can we acknowledge this toll and really trauma that may come out of viewing these protests on our social media platforms? And then how can we basically create a collective that tries to mitigate some of these harms that are coming out of viewing protests, for example. And so we ended up launching this collective with our friends, all from the Human Rights Center, and we began to focus on, well, how can we let other people know, and how can we make accessible really the powers of social media? Because I use social media on my own personally, outside of any activist related work, as you would say. But we really wanted people to understand this incredibly powerful technology. And so in creating this organization, what we began to do is create guidelines and resources and zines on what people need to know about protests. And really that breaks down into several different buckets. How can you digitally keep what you record at a protest, the photos and videos you protest, safe? And then how can you also maybe use some of these videos and photos in order to actually, take some tangible action, whether, you're sending it to the ACLU or the National Lawyers Guild and having some sort of a legal case be built for it, or you're actually sending it to organizations like Amnesty International, who are then using your photos and your videos to have campaigns in advocating against, for example, not using lethal force in protests and not using tear gas in protests. And so the guides and the resources that we created, which I think are linked in the PowerPoint presentation at the end, which I really encourage all of you to look at. I think our main focus really became, how can we understand, one, the power, and how can we make knowledge accessible to everyone, whether you're a first-time protester or a long-term advocate and activist on the streets, or through organizations. how can we utilize these platforms in a way to safely and effectively document what is happening? And instead of having, for example, mainstream media report on these protests, is how can we bring the power back into our hands? You know, us with cell phones in the streets, the very people who are participating in the protests, and document and begin to develop and consolidate and really just gather together a collective, whether it's an archive or, you know, just a documentation of really what's happening in our own communities, in our own cities. And how can we then begin to really use these very videos and photos that we're taking for a specific goal and purpose? That's basically really what we do, and that's how I've tried to maintain this close relationship with protests, because I think one of the more important things to really acknowledge is that the engaging in protest is really an effort in engaging and letting community members know that A, we are in this together, and really B, like, what does it take to become to stand in solidarity with someone? You know, is it just posting, you know, on social media and talking to family members, which are all very important facets, but also then how can we become, in a lot of ways, allies and, you know, accomplices with one another in engaging in protests? I think I will leave it at that. But I think the last thing I want to highlight is one of the important key points that we've seen in all of the protests, whether we've looked at them abroad or here in the United States, is that the same tactics and weapons being used abroad are being used here. Same tactics that the military uses abroad are being used in the United States. And we can link to some of the reports that people have done on the weapons of protests and against protesters, if anyone is interested. But I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your story. And so for the next portion of the programming, we want to open it up to you students. And so if you have an experience that you would like to share, if you have a question for any of our panelists, this is your opportunity. And we want to hear from you and hear your thoughts, because, you know, one of the reasons of deciding to pivot and actually focus on protests is because this is current, this is relevant, this is happening in our own backyards. This isn't just something that we see on TV that's happening in another country. So we want to hear what your thoughts are. So you can put your question in the chat, you can raise your hand, but we want to hear from you.
If you don't want to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to use a chat, and we'll be able to read the question and ask the panelists. Or if you would like to unmute yourself or raise your hand, then we can give you the floor. Oh, so here we have a question from Stephen Edwards. When protesting through the writing of letters, is there a best practice for addressing concerns? Anyone on the panelists can answer? And I'll read it again. When protesting through the writing of letters, is there a best practice for addressing concerns?
Well, Professor Kat, you mentioned that you do a lot of letter writing. Do you mind taking this question?
Yeah, sorry, I've been speaking, but the microphone was muted.
Okay.
So, as someone that writes letters all the time, so the only thing I would say is, number one, show your intelligence, show your understanding of the issue. You can definitely be passionate, and I encourage you to be, but choose your words wisely, and then research both sides of the issue. So what I like to say is, for instance, you know, I know you passed such and such policy, and here's your reasons why. Here's why I disagree with that, and here's why. You know what I mean? So make sure that you come across as someone that is passionate about your issue, but also educated in that issue, and not just flying off the handle and being crazy and just yelling or demanding change, right? That's pretty much all I have about that. Does it answer your question, Stephen?
Any of the other panelists have any thoughts on this particular question?
I'll also add, Stephen, it's always most effective when you write your letters in your own voice. So don't try to sound like someone else. Just be yourself, but make sure that you know, dot your I's, cross your T's, and have your facts. But you can write it entirely as you would just normally. So don't try to think about writing it in somebody else's voice or somebody else's language or trying to sound some other way. Just be yourself.
So we have another question, but I believe this is for Professor Cap, for the Chicano protest. How exactly did he help you? Did he help you plan protest as well?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Yes. He actually called myself in and some other leaders. I was an officer of Mitcha at the time, so the other officers were called in. And he sat down and he showed us how to write petitions, how many signatures we need, how to picket a grocery store in a legal way, how to get permits for a protest. He explained to us that we can march, but we can't necessarily gather in one spot and like use the bullhorns and stuff like that unless you have a permit. So all those things we didn't know. So we ended up doing that, and we actually did make changes at Cal, which I'm really proud of, but we didn't get arrested again, so yay.
Great, thank you for that. Any other students have a question? Oh, so we have another question. What are the basic essentials needed when attending a protest? What type of mindset is needed? Anyone on the panelists can answer that.
I can jump in here. I would say first and foremost is find out who's organizing the event, and find out as much information as you can about them. And that'll tell you a lot about what you can expect from the event. So if you are going to an event that has been organized by somebody who's very radical, the stakes are going to be higher. But if you find somebody who you actually align with, you're more likely to be more comfortable in that space. So just research, vet, everything that you would do, social media, Googles, but even just check in with other local people who may know that organizer, and you will find out what you need to know.
I can add some on this. If you know it's going to be a violent protest, there's a lot of things you need to do. One of the things is have your way out. If you do get arrested, a lot of people write the numbers on their arms or somewhere that won't get messed up. Goggles are a good idea. Helmets are a good idea. A bicycle helmet will save you when you fall down. There's a lot of people that just get injured when they're moving a lot of people and they fall. An umbrella is a really good idea. I won't get into that, but if you care to know really how the big boys do the protest, look at Hong Kong. They've got it figured out when it comes to actually affecting in a violent way, even though it's not been effective lately. Anyway, just have lots of water. And one of the things I want to say is always have a buddy. Sometimes things, especially when there's two sides clashing, some people just kind of disappear, and you always want to have somebody that you're keeping your eye on. So those just some basics.
Before we head on to the next question, Lena, is there something that you wanted to add? I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have two guides that we published through OzRock. The first is protecting your privacy, and the second is how to
Oh no, was she muted?
Is it okay if I add a few things while Lena is getting, I think maybe her internet fixed?
Yes, go ahead.
As Lena was mentioning, we have two guides. One is on really getting down to the nitty gritty of like what settings do I need to have adjusted on my social media before I attend a protest. And then the second one is really a little bit more general, but also very important. And so we give advice like download the app Signal so you're sending secure messages to one another. Write the National Lawyers Guild number on your Sharpie in case you're arrested and you need to call a lawyer. Delete any, turn off fingerprint and face unlock. So that if your phone is confiscated, for example, that they can't easily just open it and look through your phone. Our guides really walk you through a whole host of what to know and what kind of scenarios you should take certain measures for that you might encounter in a protest, such as like if you run into tear gas or if you see someone getting arrested, etc. And I linked both of that the guide in the chat. And I think Lena's trying to get back into this. Lena, are you back?
I'm back, yes.
Okay, I'll let you continue.
Sorry to interrupt. No, basically, like to speak candidly, we are being surveilled. So, and that is one of the primary means that protests are halted and they're stopped and protesters are intimidated. So, what I mean by surveilled is that there's something called like a stingray, which is like, imagine a cell phone tower. And for example, the Minnesota Police Department has a $2 million contract with the folks that produce stingrays. So this is something that's incorporated in a lot of our local police departments. And what it allows police to do is to basically track and locate the identity of your phone numbers in an area. So say, for example, they find one phone and then they are able to find all phones in the same perimeter. So if they're targeting a protest, they can identify everybody present at the protest. And I know that may sound really big and scary, but there are tangible ways to prevent yourself and from having your privacy breached. And if y'all want to take out your phones, I can walk you through this process. But the first thing is to turn off your Wi-Fi, turn off your Bluetooth when you attend a protest. If you go to location settings, turn off your location so that your location is not attached to any of your photos. The next thing to do is to join a Signal group. I don't know if y'all have heard of Signal, but basically it's a private messaging app that's encrypted. So that means that folks can't intercept your messages when you send them between people. And what a Signal group allows you to do, kind of bouncing off what Nathan said, is establish a buddy system. It allows you to find each other if you get lost, right? But it also allows you to plan exit strategies. And we're seeing a lot of this on Instagram as well. I don't know if y'all saw it, but for example, in LA, there were ICE present at a lot of the protests, which is really scary for folks, especially if you're undocumented, and a lot of the protesters were, or if you're just a person of color who could be profiled. And they were waiting at certain areas and they were doing something called Kettling. And I don't know if you have heard of this, but it's a military strategy in which the police, and they've done this at multiple protests, basically attempt to lock in the protesters from either end of a street. For example, in Brooklyn, they trapped people on the bridge, right? So they don't let you leave. You can't use the bathroom. You can't get access to water. And if you're tear gassed, then you're basically stuck in a bottle of that tear gas. And as y'all know, like tear gas is a less lethal weapon, but it causes significant damage to your breathing, to your skin, to your nervous system. And because of that, it's quite, it's war, right? It's a military strategy. And so not to get, off topic, but back to prevention and assessing your risk, what folks can do with Signal and like Telegraph and these sort of apps that allow you to have encrypted messaging is to find exit strategies. So I saw in LA, somebody posted to go through a particular parking lot structure so that they could exit the protest safely and not encounter ICE, to get out of the Kettling strategy. And that's really important to know, especially when it seems like there is no way out. The second thing I want to speak about is when you're posting photos, and maybe Shakiba can help me out a little bit on this, but when you post a photo, there's something in every single photograph called metadata. And in your metadata is your name, the location where you took it, and information about your phone. And sometimes, for example, if you want to send a picture to the National Lawyers Guild, if you want to send a picture to the ACLU, having that data attached to a photograph is really important for verifying the picture. You know, you see a lot of times these days that pictures are doctored, they're changed, and folks want to prevent that because there's a lot of really important evidence in these pictures. It can show police brutality, right? Think about the George Floyd protests. It was one video, gruesome video, that incited massive protests on the streets. And of course, we shouldn't need, right, videos for us to believe that Black Lives Matter, for us to believe that there is police brutality. But of course, we have to recognize the visual value embedded within these pictures. So one thing you can do with your photos before you post them on Facebook, Instagram, what have you, is take those pictures and call your local National Lawyer Guild number. And another big thing before you go to protest, folks, is write that number on your arm. If you are arrested, okay, if you are seeing your friend being arrested, you look at your arm, you look at the phone number you've written down, you call the National Lawyers Guild, you tell them exactly what's happening, you get the police badge number, you get the streets, you get the time of day, you get your friend's birthday or whoever's being arrested, their birthday, and you call them. And if you're recording it, you say, hey folks, I have this recording and I want to do something with it. I don't know if I should post it yet. And they will tell you what to do. And this is really important because a lot of us see really important information and we don't know what to do with it, right? But we want justice. We want people to be prosecuted. And this is a really important way that we're able to do that. So write the National Lawyers Guild number on your phone, turn off Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and location services on your phone. And you can do that, for example, if you have an iPhone, just by swiping up and clicking those 4 blue icons so they make sure that you're gray. I don't know if y'all understand what I'm saying, but y'all are sound tech savvy. I mean, we're on Microsoft Teams and I did not know how this worked until about 5 minutes ago. So those are some tips. And I know that was a lot to throw at y'all, but we've attached all those resources both in this Microsoft Teams, and I will put them in the chat as well. And we've made them into zines. So you can print it and fold it and put it in your back pocket. And for each case scenario, say, when you see somebody being tear gassed, we tell you how to take pictures. We tell you what to do with those photos. We tell you about tear gas first aid. And another big thing, folks, and this is what the last thing I'll leave you with before Shakiba can maybe add, is cover your faces. I know obviously it's important because of a pandemic, but it's important even before. Cover your faces with a bandana, wear black clothing, wear long sleeves, don't let any tattoos show. Y'all want to be as non-identifiable as possible. And I really want to emphasize that folks like to call protests violent. And I think we need to really discuss what violence means, right? What's violent is police officers tear gassing and kettling folks. What's violent is police brutality. What's violent is police murder. What's not violent is exercising your peaceful right to protest. And I think what becomes difficult, though, is what is peaceful. And I think that the government likes to call folks that exercise this right violent in order to delegitimize their right, in order to tell them that you going out on the streets is too violent. You going out on the streets and demanding your rights is too violent. But we really have to destigmatize that. We also have to just destigmatize the word radical. Okay, if we look at what radical means, it means getting at the root, right? It's not reform. It's not just kind of like changing the coding or like making it look gold when really underneath it's all rusty. Radical is about completely lifting something up from the roots. I always like to think about a plant or a tree. If you cut off a branch, it will grow back. If you rip it from the roots, there's no chance. So that's what I'll leave you with. And thank you for hearing me ramble for a minute.
Thank you so much for that, Lena. Now I'm going to go ahead and ask like the next 2-3 questions that I see on the chat. I know one of them was for Nathan.
I actually have one more thing that I want to say, if that's okay.
Oh, go for it.
Because I think it's crucial, because especially because I teach Mexican American history and I have a lot of students that fall under this, and I plead with them every semester, and I beg you, if you are under DACA, please do not protest. It is not going to be worth it for you. Let my friends protest for you. Let us be your voice. Please don't do that. That's all.
Yes, definitely be careful because DACA right now is also hanging by a thread. So by all means, what Professor Kat said, let us do it for you. Let us be your voice so that you don't get that removed away from you. So I know, Nathan, there is 2 questions for journalists. Thank you for all of them. I am trying to read it again because I just lost it. So as a journalist, can you protest when you are not working, or do you just prefer not to? And then the next question for you was also, do all media outlets have their own rules, but in general, is it not a good idea to show in public because of their political beliefs, or what? Sorry. I know you have in the chat, but for the others.
First of all, I wanted to tag on to what Lena said. There are situations. I was at the first protest after the Dallas police shootings, and there are situations in there where there were some. I'm not making any judgments, but at that particular protest, there was a lot of police officers that were basically trying to start a fight, and they wanted somebody to throw a punch so they can go all out and arrest a bunch of people. That will happen. It does happen. So don't take the bait. The protest question, yeah, everybody has their own rules. As far as Dallas Morning News had the rules, WFAA has their rules. Everybody is different. But in general, you just don't want. I never protested. I never had a yard sign. I do now, but I never had anything on Facebook that had any kind of political showing, because that right kind of gets stripped away from you as a journalist because you have this other responsibility. I'm sure if I really wanted to, I could go and do that, but it would be a discussion with HR, and I've never really had that discussion. But it's probably not a good idea that they would. I know they would frown upon it. And what was the other side of that question?
Give me a second. I'm looking for it again. I think you covered it all. So as a journalist, can you protest when you are not working, or do you just prefer not to? And then there was a comment about it. I think that was it. I know that there's another question here in the chat that is asking, how do you begin a protest? And I think Myra has some good, valuable information that she would also like to share. Sorry.
So can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sorry, it says, how do I begin to find a group that protests if I wanted to join?
Oh, yeah. So again, I would go back to vetting groups. You can, because everything is always available on social media of sorts. If there's a particular group whose ideologies or goals that you align with, you can look at their social media stuff to see what their vibe is and see if that's something that you want to participate, and then start engaging that conversation. Me personally, I'm going to throw out Our City, Our Future, because that's who I'm a member of. We are currently involved with the City of Dallas budget votes that's coming up. I know that a couple of you may have heard about defunding the police. We are the actual group that has put together what we call the People's Budget, which is a report from residents of Dallas and what their priorities in our budget is. And some of the things that we have that are available is actually coming up next week. So the City of Dallas will vote on their budget for the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year. And the 23rd, next week, Wednesday, is the last date that we have in order to have some sort of input into that budget. So what I'm going to ask for you guys to do is, if you have opinions about how the City of Dallas budget is allocated and how we use those funds, I invite you to sign up to speak at City Council and actually address our elected officials. And the way we can do that is by contacting the city secretary and asking to be put on their speakers list for next week, Wednesday. And what I dropped in the chat was the 3 ways to sign up. So you can either send an email, you can call, or you can use the online form. Personally, for me, calling is the easiest. It literally takes under a minute. And all I have to do is call them, give them my name, my address, and what it is I want to speak on, which would be the budget hearing next Wednesday. And that's it. With that being said, this Wednesday, I think there was 50 speakers that signed up to speak. So the earlier that you sign up to speak, the earlier you're called. So that makes a difference. And some of these hearings have gone on for longer than 10 hours. So you don't have to stick around for all that time, but it is always great to get your voice out. And if you are really curious and on the fence about speaking at City Hall, I invite you to our People's Budget Call next week, Monday. And I've dropped the link in the chat. And it'll be a webinar via Zoom where we will kind of bring you up to speed with everything that's happened in this budget process, give you tips for how to put your speech together. You only have 2 minutes to speak. We're also able to answer any other like background questions or how-to questions that you may have. So please join us and get involved.
Okay, students, so as we wrap up this event, thank you so much to the panelists and for those that are asking questions. I do want to reiterate that this PowerPoint with resources will be available for you all on the team site, and you can always come back and view it. I believe Tiffany do you want to add anything?
No, I'm about to say, yeah, again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists, for your time and your knowledge and sharing that with us. Thank you for the participants for coming and engaging with us for an hour and a half. I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to even more events. And yeah, again, don't forget to fill out the assessment. I know that as far as the students, the professors have urged, please put your name and in the chat so we can give credit, so we know who attended. And I think that's it.
I do want to quickly just mention to folks listening and the students that if you all have any questions about open source, about keeping yourself safe, about your risks, you all can contact us at any time. I just put our email and our Twitter in the bio. And I really want to emphasize that, we just want to create the things that are actually needed and answer questions that are really tough. So if y'all want to reach out, you can reach out to us. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tiffany and Angie. I really appreciate y'all making this space.
Alrighty, thank you so much to Nathan, Lena, Myra, Professor Kat, and Shakiba. Thank you so much again for joining us, and of course, Professor Tiffany Lacoste for helping me put this together. As we close out, I'm going to go ahead and share our last video with Summer Weasley, and please look in the chat. Links have been posted for the first video that we showed, the last video we're about to show, and yeah, so please go ahead and fill out the assessment. Jessica will post it here again in a second, and let me go ahead and share the last video.
My name is Summer Wesley. I am a citizen of the Choctaw Nation, and I live in Oklahoma, where I do the majority of my community advocacy work. I am a founding board member of Live Indigenous OK, which advocates for policy related to the Indigenous community. I am a board member of Matriarch, which is a community group to empower Indigenous women. I've worked, been on the front lines for many different issues. We have had some successes, such as getting Indigenous Peoples Day declared in both Norman and Oklahoma City. I did receive the Human Rights Award a few years ago from the city of Norman. Primarily, my work and advocacy is related to human rights issues. If I'm in a leadership capacity, it is generally related to Indigenous issues, but I do a lot of support work, helping other communities, amplifying them, but always when it is their community that is affected, they are the ones who should be leading, obviously. They asked me to tell you about my first protest. My first protest would have been it was my freshman year of college. I had just turned 17, so it was 1998, 99. There is a restaurant in Stillwater that uses a slur for Inuit people as their name and has a horribly offensive caricature as their logo. And that was the first protest that I went to. Unfortunately, Racist Joe's still uses that name and mascot. They did go through the pretense of pretending they had finally heard us, and then had an incredibly biased survey, and then chose to go ahead and keep their racism as their brand. So unfortunately, that one was not successful, but I did learn a lot. I learned about, of course, how protests work, but also how important language is, representation, that these seemingly small issues actually affect much larger ones, and they have ripple effects, and there is overlap. And so it's important to work on all levels. So don't ever feel like something that you feel strongly about is too small of an issue, because all of those small building blocks are what are foundational to the larger inequities that exist. As far as change in protests from when I started till now, we still use a lot of the same organization. I mean, the goal is still the same, right? Disruption. That it's meant to make people uncomfortable. It's meant to disrupt the status quo, because rights and improvements are not just given ever, right? If we look back at this, unquestionably, this government was established on a foundation of white supremacy. The Declaration of Independence referred to Indigenous people as merciless Indian savages. The Constitution enshrined in it that Black people were only 3/5 of human beings, right? So it's unquestionable that the foundation is inequitable. And none of the improvements, if we look back over time, none of the improvements that we have had have happened just on their own. They are all the result of a lot of hard work and disruption. And so so it's important to exercise those rights that are given in the Constitution, because if we don't do those, if we don't exercise those First Amendment rights, we risk not only failing to move forward, because nothing is ever static. If we aren't moving forward, we will be regressing, which I think we have seen in the last 4 years. And so if we aren't moving forward, we will be going backwards, and we will lose those rights. Now, as far as changes in protests, what I've seen from that time is what we go prepared for is much different. We used to be prepared for what to do if you get arrested, know your numbers, know how to get bailed out, those procedures. Now we're literally having to go and be prepared with medics, and setting up first aid stations. And so violence perpetrated by the police forces has escalated dramatically. That is not something that we had to consider at most times 20 years ago, only in very dramatic situations such as takeovers, like we've seen even prior to that. There was like the Alcatraz takeover and the BIA takeover, the Wounded Knee. those things we would be prepared on that level. But now we have to prepare on that level for a simple unity rally to ask the police to stop murdering, to stop murdering citizens. So unfortunately, I think that is the most dramatic change that we've experienced. What advice would I give students to participate and organize is definitely do it. Use your voice. Get in touch with people who have done these things for many years. I fortunately have been mentored by people who, had been in civil rights and human rights movements longer than I've been alive, and they taught me many things, and we build on and see, because we aren't taught these things in most of our education. We only know about the major demonstrations, right? But along the way, there are a lot of things that have been tried, a lot of approaches that have failed or succeeded or showed progress or promise, and we aren't automatically going to know those things. So if you get in touch with the leaders who have been engaged on an ongoing basis, they can help you with that. There is no reason to reinvent the wheel here, right? The focus needs to be on unity and working as a goal-oriented process. Otherwise, you just expend resources and end up burning out trying to redo things that have already been tried. And it is important to be civically engaged. I do vote as a form of harm reduction. I think anyone who bothers to look up or do a Google search on any of my public writing knows that I have significant concerns, particularly since I practiced law, which I no longer do, with the inherent issues in the system. But I do think as long as the system continues to exist, that harm reduction through working within it is important. In fact, I'm running for state representative in my House district right now. But also I think it is very much important that we continue to engage on these grassroots levels to actually, because changing those things is where it's really going to make the difference down the road. Policy can only go so far in an inherently equitable system. We have to actually break down those foundational pillars and rebuild them. And that is only going to come through organizing and protesting and holding leadership accountable. And so I do encourage everyone to please stay engaged. Please exercise your constitutional rights, but definitely go in aware, because it is and can be a very dangerous situation. So go in absolutely honest with yourself about what you're willing to give up, how much you're willing to do, and keep fighting for a better world.
Alrighty, that concludes our programming. Again, thank you so much to all of our panelists, everyone that attended, all the great questions. Please be sure to continue to check the team site, because all of those resources are still available for you, as well as the PowerPoint. Miss Tiffany, if you want to add anything.
I think I'm good. I mean, I'm so touched. I think thank you for help making this event such a wonderful, everyone behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, the panelists. Thank you for last minute answering my emails, calls, and agreeing to help out. I appreciate it.
Alrighty, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. Bye.
All right.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.